So the guy that was kind of instrumental really in helping me was this guy called the curator of trees, Jonathan Jukes, on the Marks Hall estate, where this 800-year-old tree still sits. You know, I visited it a couple of weeks ago. And Jonathan was fantastic, because I did approach him and say, look, I'd like to, I've got this idea for this project. I'd like to just come and sit beside the oak at all times of day and night. So would that be all right? Would the estate be okay with me coming in when, you know, because it's an operating business, and he just, I kind of thought he might just dismiss me, but he's a tree guy. He understood what I wanted to do. And so what he did was he just said, yeah, absolutely. And then the point was that I could go there, you know, in the middle of the night, the first thing in the morning when the main gates weren't open, and I was given access to a kind of a side door, literally. And this enabled me to start this project where I would go there, you know, almost every day initially, and then through the seasons, you know, through snowy winters, you know, all, you know, beautiful boiling hot summer's days, and just spend time there. I mean, originally the idea was to get to know, as I explained, get to know the ecosystem, yes, of the tree. But gradually things changed, and the project kind of morphed, if you like. And as you say, one of the narrative threads of the book really that emerged right from that first meeting was Jonathan told me that if I'd been there 60 years before, I would have been standing not just next to one 800-year-old oak tree, but around 300, and that these 300 oaks of around that age had all been cut down in the 1950s, purely just for kind of cash, literally. And this was obviously this was a hugely kind of, I mean, it was genuinely a kind of powerful moment when he explained this to me. Yes. And it very much made me realize that this, even from that first meeting, that the story that I had in mind would to kind of write a year in the life of an ancient oak just wasn't going to be sufficient to tell the story that needed to be told.
Well, I love the moment when you are first winched up in the oak and you are alone. And could you describe it? And you sat there for quite a long time. One wasn't comfortable, but also you have this phrase, do not think, but become an oak. What do you mean by that?
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I was very, I mean, again, thanks to this fantastic figure, Jonathan Jukes, the curator of trees. As I say, he recognized the project that I was doing, and he said, well, one of the things you need to do is you want to go up in there. And I mean, this is a big tree. This is, you know, this is 30 foot round, the trunk, you know, so it's a big tree. To get into the tree, we had to get in kind of professional arboriculturalists with ropes, and you know, it wasn't just a question of me just clambering in. Right. So this big old ladder, one day in spring, a day, you know, sort of early May, and I went up. I had to go up. Actually, I had to go up with an expert, because they wouldn't allow me, due to health and safety, to be there on my own because I might fall out. But yeah, so I went up, and of course this young lad I was with was very keen to climb to the topmost, you know, reaches of this tree, you know, way over 100 foot off the ground. Amazing. I didn't want that. I was on a kind of existential quest to sit within what's known as the bole, the kind of central kind of part of the tree, and just observe the blue tits, which were just raising their young, and they were collecting lots of caterpillars, and I just wanted to spend time there. So we had a kind of slight variance, and we agreed that he could go and clamber up in the top branches, and I would just sit there for a couple of hours. So that's what we agreed to. And I guess that's all that sense of trying to kind of in some way kind of become the oak, if you like. I mean, in some ways that evolved further down the project as I started reading various philosophers, like Martin Buber, about recognizing the individuality of every oak, of every tree.
Right.
You know, this is the important point. I mean, I started to recognize, you know, this kind of central point, really, which is pretty basic, which is that every tree is an individual living being, just as we are of humans, you know. And it's pretty basic, it's pretty obvious, but it's also really important, I think, for us as humans to start to remind ourselves of that kind of thing.
You also talk about that, you say that the aged oak is unparalleled in biodiversity. Could you explain a bit more about that and why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, the oaks are a really interesting kind of genus, really. And as I say, I speak not as an expert in this, but it is an interesting genus in that there are sort of 500 species that are specifically of the oak, and they're all over the world. So unfortunately, there aren't a kind of native species where you're sitting, but all around the northern hemisphere, you have these oaks, and they go right down into Mexico and South America, etc. And what's really interesting is that oaks have always been very, very close to the indigenous people, to the inhabitants of those landscapes. So they're kind of favored trees where they grow. Right. You know, I mean, I guess obviously in Australia, there would be other trees that might be favored by the indigenous peoples. And essentially that's what we're talking about with oaks. With oaks, what they provided was really good wood for building things, whether it's houses, boats, etc., but also good wood for burning. And then, of course, what they also provided was acorns, and this was an absolutely vital thing for the early farming communities right around the world. Neolithic peoples, we know, relied on acorns as an absolutely guaranteed harvest that they could feed both themselves and their animals on. So this connection between oaks and ancient peoples, I didn't know about before I started this project, and this was one of the kind of revelations to me as I began my researches.
So, what do you think about this idea that they are connecting and speaking to each other under the ground?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Suzanne Simard she's just had her book published literally about 2 days ago.
Oh, really?
I would urge
yeah.
Well, I've just been in 2 talks that she's been involved with this week. Yeah, and she's, I mean, if you haven't heard of her, definitely look her up. Suzanne Simard. She's basically an absolute legend within kind of this world of trees and forestry and ecology, because what she established amongst the scientific community was this solid truth that trees are, if you like, and again, this is the language issue, communicating. They are in touch with each other in that they're passing nutrients, etc. Through the fungal networks on their root systems, if I can put it like that, very crudely. And we know this from experiments that Suzanne Simard did in the 1990s in British Columbia. And she was literally kind of dismissed, pushed out of the scientific community for a number of years. She's a very tough woman. She comes from kind of logging ancestry out in, as I say, in British Columbia in Canada. And her book explains, you know, this sense that she knew what she was finding, and she'd known this since she was young, but she needed to prove it scientifically. And this link between kind of, if you like, if I can put it as kind of indigenous knowledge and the scientific world, I think it's a really interesting one that we're seeing all around the world now.
Yes.
This kind of intuitive, you know, human noticing of the natural world. And then unfortunately what's happened in the last, you know, few hundred years, a lot of us, particularly in the West, and as you say, the industrialized Australia, you know, the urbanized Australia, we've become kind of less a part of the natural world. And I think it's all to do with this, that idea of getting back into recognizing we are of nature. You know, there's no like, oh, nature's out there. No, we're just animals. We're just like animals, bits of nature as well. And that kind of sense of connection with the natural world, I think, is what is our next important step as we try to deal with things like climate emergency, etc. I think that's an absolutely essential step for us to take as a species.